And ladies and gentlemen, our last witness is Vikram. Vikram Singh. Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh is the Vice President for the National Security and International Policy at American Progress. Previously, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia at the Pentagon, where he advised senior leadership on all policy matters pertaining to development and implementation of defense strategies and plans for the region until November 2011. Mr. Singh was the Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the U.S. Department of State. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the co-chairs. Thank you all of you for inviting me here to testify at the end of a very long day. I've been asked to talk about the nature of American leadership, so I suppose coming either first in the day or last in the day is appropriate. As you said, I'm the Vice President for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress. I just want to start by noting that Democratic Party platforms have long featured strong, progressive, forward-looking visions for America's role in the world. And that kind of a vision is going to be really critical for our nation's security in the years ahead. We face an unparalleled diversity of threats and challenges that have been touched on by witnesses all throughout the day today. And almost none of them can be handled by any one nation acting alone. This is why I think principled American leadership is key to our future security and prosperity. When America leads well, the world becomes safer and more secure. When we turn inward, it is quite the opposite. Principled leadership starts with honest appraisals of the threats we face, rooted in facts, not fear. Principled leadership requires building coalitions, maintaining resolve to deter conflict, and encouraging a path back to engagement when crisis invariably strikes. This kind of leadership finds its political home in the modern Democratic Party for several reasons. First, Democratic leadership views war as a last resort, never as a first choice. Democrats will always use force if needed to protect Americans, but see that unilateralism and preventive war are failures of leadership. Second, Democrats recognize the importance of partners, that we are better off with partners than we are going it alone, and that we stand with our friends and allies. Finally, Democrats understand that diplomacy, development, and economic statecraft are critical to stopping crises, and we fight for greater investment in the non-military tools of our national power in order to make us more safe. Principled leadership like this is what the next president will need to deal with the challenges we face. I want to give a couple of examples. To defeat radical jihadist terrorism, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, we need to steadily help countries like Iraq and Syria and other nations take back territory from extremists. Territory from which they can launch attacks not only in the local area, but far afield, in Europe or in the United States. Disrupting the flow of foreign fighters is also important. We have to go after their communications, their finances, their ability to travel. And we have to toughen up our defenses at home. But this is not just a military problem. We also need to recognize that the ideology of hate that has created jihadi terrorism was nurtured over years by investments in education made by those who had these kinds of beliefs. And we need to start thinking about how we help invest in a different kind of education and help other countries do so. We need to think about weak and at-risk states who need global help to forge a path towards stability, fend off threats from militants, and find viable solutions, political solutions that can heal the divisions in their societies, especially by reducing corruption and sectarian politics. We cannot do it for them, but we can help them work at it. To counter nuclear proliferation, another example, we need to bring nations together, as the Obama administration managed to do, to impose sanctions and to negotiate a deal that brought an end to Iran's current nuclear ambitions, and if enforced, will delay them for years or perhaps permanently. That kind of tough approach, backed by military power and deterrence, can apply to other serious threats, like North Korea. Or to handle China's rise, we need a combination of resolve and engagement. We need to welcome China's larger role on the world stage, But we also need to stand by countries should they be subjected to coercion or bullying or the seizure of territory that's been disputed between the parties. A similar truth applies to our engagement with Russia. We need to stand by Ukraine, which has been the victim of aggression and the loss of its territory through the use of force in contravention of all international norms and of international law. That means we may need to continue to support long-term economic sanctions, perhaps for an indefinite period. That means we need to encourage others to have resolve in this area. It does not mean we cannot do anything with Russia, but we should be clear about what is acceptable, what is not, and what we will stand for. A last example, to protect our industries, our infrastructure, our identities, and our government from cyber attacks, we have to work with other nations and the private sector to share threat information and cooperate on investigation and prosecution. We cannot protect ourselves alone. I think I'm well over my time.
Yes.
I wanted to touch on the contrast with Republicans, but perhaps we can do that in the question and answer.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ellison. And then...
How would you contrast what you said with what the Republican position might be?
I think I contrasted it very, very starkly. The contrast with Republicans right now couldn't be more stark. Republicans have nominated a candidate who thinks nuclear proliferation might be okay. Republicans have nominated a candidate who thinks maybe we should pull out of core alliances like NATO, or maybe it's okay to target the families of terrorists. To say that the bulk of the Republican Party doesn't support those kinds of views and it's just because they have an outlier as a candidate, I think is a great disservice. That is not what we're talking about here.
What do you think, what would you advise us on the U.S. Paying dues at the UN and pulling out of institutions like UNESCO? I mean, a few years ago, when Palestinians joined UNESCO, we, by operation of law, had to pull out. I kind of felt like that wasn't us at our best. But, you know, there are a few institutions, examples like us, you know, sort of stepping away from multilateral institutions. Should the Democratic platform reflect some commitment to multilateralism and the U.S. playing a leadership role in international organizations?
Representative Ellison, absolutely we need to focus on multilateralism and being at the table. You cannot lead if you are not at the table. So simply withdrawing in protest is often a satisfying thing to do in the near term, perhaps it's politically expedient, but at the end of the day, we only lead when we show up.
You mentioned the situation in Ukraine. The problem is actually broader than that, isn't it? I mean, there's Georgia, there's Moldova, and there's Poland, and there's real insecurity. I want to just ask you to broaden out the discussion about Europe and the challenges we face in Europe vis-a-vis Russia, and also, as I mentioned with an earlier witness, the problem of refugees now changing the political landscape in Europe in a very threatening way. Could you discuss, I know that's a lot, but I feel that our platform needs to reflect how we engage Europe vis-a-vis Russia and the challenges we face there, whether it's expansion of NATO further, and how we deal with the issue of this radicalization process that's taking place on many fronts, partly as a result of this backlash to refugees coming into Europe.
This refugee crisis, Mr. Dogby, is the kind of crisis that tests us at a very profound level. When it is reacted to in fear, it sparks division, and it sparks the kind of rise of right-wing populism that we're seeing in many countries. It is really only going to be something that enables greater unity if we rise to it with basically an openness and an embracing of people that are in desperate straits. And I think the Democratic Party is well positioned to articulate America's long-standing commitment to that kind of basic humanitarianism, not just because it's good for those people, but because it's ultimately good for our interests. I think that this is going to be the biggest challenge the European project has faced in the last 70 years. And I do not know where it will come out, but I know the United States should be on the side of a unified Europe that welcomes the victims of violence and seeks to stop the root causes of the violence that is driving them from their homes. On Russia, I think it's quite simple. There is a pattern. It is not a new pattern. It goes back to Georgia, it involves Moldova, it involves Ukraine, and in Ukraine it was the most extreme example we've seen to date. So the question now is, can Russian behavior be channeled and shaped through steady resolve from the rest of the world? And the rest of the world may not include everybody, but it'll include us and our European allies. And I hope that the bite of sanctions, the opportunity to re-engage and reshape the kind of relationship we are going to have with Russia will lead to a different kind of decision down the road. But in the meantime, I think it is very important to note that we're going to be there with our friends, and that we're going to not decide that it's okay to retroactively accept this kind of violation of sovereignty, which is, after all, a fundamental principle of global stability.
Our final question will come from Ms. Sandin. Did you have a question?
Yes, sorry. I wanted to ask just a very simple question, because I think these issues get very confusing about unilateralism, unilateral actions. What is your standard around military engagement? What do you think is the right way for the military to ever use force, ever? And then, of the candidates, I'm not familiar with a presidential candidate at the moment on the Democratic side who has called for unilateral action without allies, who is calling for boots on the ground anywhere. So I'd just love to get your thoughts on those two issues.
Well, I think I'm very glad that we don't have a Democratic candidate that is calling for unilateral action and boots on the ground everywhere. I think that is the hallmark of the prudent use of our power, the responsible use of our power. I do think that there is a distinction between a large-scale invasion and helping a country manage its own internal security or a regional security challenge. So I do think putting, for example, special forces on the ground to help Iraq retake territory from ISIS is an appropriate use of American military power. I do not believe that you can ever have just a simple litmus test, because most of the situations that threaten Americans are complex and rapidly evolving, and we sincerely all hope that we have chosen leaders who will decide wisely when they're faced with what are going to be often impossible and certainly very difficult choices. So I think it requires that we always comply with the law of armed conflict, the law of war, that we stick to our principles, that we have identified what a threat is and what the military tool can do with that threat, and that our leaders, our civilian leaders, are taking the advice of our military leaders. But if Americans are really threatened, it's appropriate to use all the tools at our disposal to protect Americans. And if our allies and friends are threatened or are suffering a domestic catastrophe, I think it is appropriate for us to figure out means of security assistance to help them secure their own countries.
Kevin, did you have a question? I'm sorry I didn't see you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for that testimony, which was the right way to end the day, nuanced and interesting and stimulating in all kinds of ways. You did a good job. I was quite interested in you were talking about some of the almost overdetermined causes of the crisis in Syria. And it struck me that one you didn't get to was this spate of academic studies in the last few years demonstrating that the greatest drought to hit the Fertile Crescent in thousands of years was maybe a deep underlying factor. And I guess in a larger sense, what it made me wonder is, and this may not wonder, it's climate change is arguably, maybe not even arguably, the greatest global problem that we've ever faced. But it's not a problem that's easily fit into our kind of national security thinking in any of sort of the world's national security establishments. It's a kind of been set in some place kind of betwixt and between domestic policy and foreign policy and things. Do you think that that's changing post-Paris? Do you think that it really is are there ways that we can help make it a lens through which we understand foreign policy going forward?
Thank you for that question. In the 5-minute version of my testimony, that was definitely in there. The fact is that the United States military has long recognized that climate change is going to be one of the largest drivers of instability and conflict, and therefore one of the largest threats to American national security. The National Intelligence Council has long recognized the same thing. So in congruence with the scientific community of the world, our national security professionals see that this is a fundamental challenge. I believe the tide is turning to the point at which we will start talking about the security implications of climate change the same way we talk about the security implications of Vladimir Putin. And I think that'll be a very important change, and it is something that this party can highlight in this platform in ways that will advance the debate significantly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank thank you for your testimony. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, boss.
I want to thank all the witnesses who have appeared today. I want to thank Chairman Deputy Wasserman Schultz for doing such a great job, and the entire staff. I want to thank you. In the meantime, we're going to be meeting on February 17th and 18th in Phoenix. If you have any concerns, these issue concerns, things that may have come up, documents you may need, Andy Grossman is the person that you want to be in touch with. He's very excited to hear from you. Again, I want to thank all of our members of our committee for your time and for your efforts. As I said when we first met, this is a very important time in our country's history. It is a very important time for our country. And we are so blessed to have this opportunity to be able to be a part of shaping a roadmap, not only for the next generation, next election, but for the next generation and for generations yet unborn. And so I'll see you all in Phoenix. Bye-bye now.